Today I'm going to concentrate mostly on our Isaiah reading, and particularly on one aspect of that reading, which is the emotional tone of what we just heard from our Old Testament scripture. Emotions are kind of wonderful things, but they're certainly complicating things, aren't they? Sometimes our emotions lift us up, sometimes they drag us a long way down, sometimes we perhaps feel like we'd rather be without them. And then you stop and realise, well, what would life be without an emotional dimension to it? You know, we'd just be sort of like robotic beings, and all the excitement and all of the life would be drained away. So emotions are important and they're valuable, but they're also very tricky things. A lot of the time, they don't seem to be in our control. They're not always consistent with each other, and they are very, very powerful. Did you notice the emotional tone of our reading from Isaiah today? It's a divine commission about to announce good news of a changed state of affairs, and I hope you noticed the way it is delivered. It's delivered with a kind of a breathless, excited enthusiasm. If you were to extract from this reading somehow the emotion of the text, you would lose a lot, maybe most of the meaning of the text. Let me remind you of what we've heard. In verse 1, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. You can feel the excitement in these words. And then in verse 3, to provide for those who mourn in Zion, to give them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit. And down in verse 10, I will greatly rejoice in the Lord. My whole being shall exult in my God. The law of Israel stated that every 50 years a ram's horn would be blown to signify the arrival of something called the Year of Jubilee. The Year of Jubilee was a year in which debts would be cancelled, slaves would be set free, property that had been sold to repay debts was to be returned to its original ancestral families and owners. When Isaiah announces in verse 1 the year of the Lord's favour, that is what he's alluding to. Except he's clearly referring not simply to a calendar year, he's referring to the arrival of a new age, a new epoch. And in our gospel reading, we hear John the Baptist, another prophet, also speaking of that age, crying out, "Make straight the way of the Lord." Again, John is announcing not just a new age, but a new age arriving in the person of the Lord, one whose sandal he's not even fit to untie. So here are two witnesses to the light, John and Isaiah, both looking forward to an age to come, both witnessing to a light that was yet to dawn. And you may recall that near the beginning of Jesus' ministry in Nazareth, he visited a synagogue in Nazareth, in his hometown, and he read in the synagogue that day this very passage from the prophet Isaiah. And then, as Luke tells us in Luke chapter 4, with all the people's eyes fixed on him, he gives what is possibly the shortest, but also one of the most provocative sermons ever delivered, when he simply says, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." This is the year of the Lord's favour, he says. The year that the captives are set free. The year that broken hearts are healed. That the mourning are now able to rejoice. That this has arrived in my presence and in my ministry. And as we know, Jesus went on, didn't he, to proclaim good news, to declare blessing upon the poor, inheritance to the meek, and joy to the mourning. And we as his disciples continue that task of announcing good news to the world. This emotive, this joyful, excited message is declared by Isaiah and John in advance, but it has now arrived. The substance of that message has now arrived in Jesus Christ. And all I'm asking us to see today is the emotional register that this message is delivered in. And my question for us today is, what impact, if any, has the gospel of Jesus Christ had on the shape of your emotional life? What impact has this announcement made on the shape of your emotional life? And even asking that question, I'm very conscious it's a dangerous question to ask, and not just because the answer might be a bit frightening and sobering, but also because the issues themselves are complicated issues. As I said before, emotions are not things that are entirely in our control. And it's a terrible thing when you're feeling down to have added to you the burden of guilt. That not only are you feeling down, but that for some reason you shouldn't be feeling down, you should be feeling upbeat. I don't want to deal in simplistic shortcuts today, but I also don't think it's quite healthy or even appropriate for us to ignore the emotional challenge of the gospel, because it might just be that if we were to ignore that challenge, we might be ignoring the very medicine that our soul needs, that our emotional health needs, and that the gospel of Christ uniquely provides to a world that has a whole range of emotional experiences going on. Isaiah announces what he calls good news. And as you know, the New Testament shorthand, the New Testament word for that is gospel. Gospel basically means good news. Notice the word good. Often we package the gospel in very non-emotive ways, making it or attempting to make it emotionally neutral. Sometimes the gospel's even delivered with a long face, with a note of judgment or even contempt. But if this message of Jesus Christ is not delivered as good news, then its claim to even be the gospel surely must be a very tenuous claim. This is, after all, news that Isaiah says heals broken hearts. It frees captives. The message of Jesus Christ is not emotionally neutral. It is not news, it is good news. Somebody who understood this was this gentleman, William Tyndale. You may know of him in the 16th century. He was the scholar, the translator who gave us, who did the work that now gives us essentially our English Bibles. He translated the scriptures into the vernacular of the people of his time. He came across this word, euangelion, which we translate as good news. And here's what he says to help his readers understand what that word means. Euangelion, that we call the gospel, is a Greek word and signifieth good, merry, glad and joyful tidings that maketh a man's heart glad and maketh him sing, dance and leap for joy. He goes on to say, this gospel is all of Christ, how that he hath fought with sin and death and the devil and overcome them, whereby all men that were in bondage to sin, wounded with death, overcome of the devil, are without their own merits or deservings freed, justified, restored to life and saved, brought to liberty and reconciled unto the favour of God and set at one with him again. Which tidings as many as believe and thank God are glad and sing and dance for joy. Now here's William Tyndale. You'd think a boring Anglo-Saxon like me with, emotionally stunted growth, because that's what Anglo-Saxons have. We're not particularly expressive people. But here he is telling us that this word is a word that should make us sing, dance and leap for joy. Now as you reflect on what Christ has done for you, the favour of God which you do not deserve, but which is now shining into your life through what Christ has done, through his life, his death and his resurrection, his fight with sin, his overcoming of the evil one. Are you ever, even vaguely, tempted to sing and dance and leap? Even a little bit? No? Because if you aren't, then maybe something hasn't quite sunk in that needs to sink in. Isaiah is announcing here a new era, a new age. Now, when we look at human history, we can break it into different ages. There's the prehistoric age, the classical age, there's modernity, there's the Cold War, there's of course, the pre and post iPhone age. Each age has a kind of an emotional register that is best fit The age of the Enlightenment, for instance, which has kind of dominated the last few centuries, often has been an age of unbridled optimism, sometimes even arrogance. The late 20th century, though, after 2 world wars and after decades of nuclear brinkmanship, has a more negative emotional flavour to it. What about the age that we're living in today? What's the natural, normal sort of emotional mood of the times that we are living in? Many people think that our age, you could probably call it the postmodern age, is an age of cynicism. It's negative and suspicious in its explanations for everything. We don't believe in truth. We don't believe in facts. We don't trust institutions. We cling to conspiracy theories. We show routinely contempt and suspicion of the announcements of any public figure or indeed any public announcement. That's the age that many people believe we are living in. Last year, Tom Hanks starred in a movie called A Beautiful Day in the Neighbourhood. It's a feel-good movie, deeply uncynical, deeply opposed or counter to the spirit of our age, about the beloved US children's entertainer Fred Rogers. Tom Hanks said to reporters when this movie came out, "Cynicism has become the default position for so much of daily structure and daily intercourse. Why? Because it's easy and there's good money to be made." He says, "We are allowed, I think, to feel good. There is a place for cynicism, but why begin with it right off the bat?" And when I read those words of Tom Cruise, my first thought was, I bet his agent told him to say that. But I thought that because he's right. I'm cynical. You're cynical. We are all cynical people living in a cynical age who give negative, cynical explanations for everything that we hear. Now, the point is, negative emotions are not bad. I'm not judging them at all. We are stuck with them, for one thing. We don't really have a choice. There is a legitimate place for a whole range of emotions, including negative ones. And there is scriptural warrant for these as well, things like sorrow, grief, anger, lament. The question is, are these the best we can do? Are these the best that we should hope for? Are they just as valid as the more positive emotions? Are they just as appropriate to our circumstances? Do they make best sense of the whole of reality? I'm not saying that negative emotions are bad. What I am saying is that every age has a natural default mood. And this mood is ultimately it's a response to the facts that are believed in that age. And any emotional response can be legitimate depending on whether those facts are true. What are the facts? What are the most significant defining facts of the age that you and I are living in today? What is the emotional tone that best aligns with this epoch in world history that we are living in? The good news of Jesus Christ tells us that at the end of the day, whatever our various emotional fluctuations, however inevitable the negative emotions are in response to various situations, they are not best fit in the long term for this age. They do not respond to the fullness of reality. They are inevitable. They are anomalies to be explained. They are temporary. But they do not make best overall sense of the times that we're living in. They may be a totally proper response to a particular situation that you're facing, but they are not the place that you should be satisfied to remain in the long term. They do not represent the best default position of the age of the year of the Lord's favour. Not if you really do believe that you live in the age that Isaiah prophesied. That the defining fact of our age is the coming of Christ to set us free, to announce good news, to heal our hearts. If you break your arm, it's completely appropriate to feel pain and frustration and annoyance and anxiety and to seek help. If you break your mind, if your emotions are broken, it is also appropriate to feel those things and to seek help. But if you break your arm the day after you have received an enormous sum of money that means you need never worry about your finances again, then yes, you will still experience those negative things. You will still feel frustration and pain and annoyance and all of that. But the shape of your bigger reality should eventually lift you back up, draw you back to a place of joy and contentment. It should, shouldn't it? If there is a gap between the good news and my experiences, that's because my experiences are partial. They are one sliver of reality. They are not the whole story. Of course, neither I nor you have experienced the fullness of the good news yet, but the good news was never about our present experience. Did you notice John the Baptist? The thing that he is clearest about in our reading today is that this is not about him. I am not the Messiah. I am not Elijah. I'm not worthy to be compared to him. This is not about him. This is about Christ and what he has come to do and that he will do. And the reality of Christ is a reality that, while it is yet to take full hold and find full expression in our lives, nevertheless should stir our hearts. Our emotions are going to dance around in all sorts of directions and do all kinds of crazy and unpredictable and difficult things. We are emotionally erratic. But the person who hears and believes the good news, who really does believe that it's true, who actually believes it enough to let it shape their overarching view of life, will have to find that there is a normal emotional resting state that is best fit for what they believe. And yes, we will deviate from that state, often, inevitably, but at least there is a centre line, a baseline that will remain on our radar, exercising a kind of magnetic pull on us, calling us back to something higher. We have to notice it's there first. The good news is not news about the emotions in the first instance. It's about facts, things that God has done in the world, really. So the answer to joylessness and negativity and cynicism is partly just to become reacquainted with the facts and to believe them deeply at a heart level. And to see these facts and their relative significance compared to all of the other things that are vying for our attention and trying to dominate our mood. Friends, something massive has happened. Something genuinely massive has happened. Not something small, not something of only private concern, something with cosmic, global consequences, something that heals hearts, releases prisoners, inspires exultation and praise. But we have to believe it for it to change our emotional life. We have to recognise that it's happened. And we have to allow it to expand our minds and our hearts. And very often that's where we fail. We don't let it do that work. In the Second World War, at the end of 1942, the 8th Division, a large number of Australian soldiers, including a whole swag of my relatives, were taken prisoner after the fall of Singapore. And they spent time in Changi on the Burma Railway. And those who had survived, many of them were then packed into the holds of ships and sent off to Japan, where they worked in the coal mines in Japan for the duration of the war. They endured some really terrible conditions. Eventually, towards the end of 1945, in one of the camps, some people started to hear rumours, some strange rumours about a large bomb and the end of the war. But they couldn't be sure because they'd never heard it formally announced to them. What they had noticed was that the demeanour of the guards just seemed a little different. But the guards still had the weapons. They were still in control. And it was only when a few brave souls finally took the plunge and walked past the guards, out of the camp, down into the village, that the new reality that had been experienced only as a rumour until then finally began to be believed as fact. The new reality then was able to take effect until the prisoners eventually began to refuse to take orders from the guards. Eventually the prisoners became the guards. The whole situation was reversed. But for a period of time they were living in slavery even though freedom had been declared. And I'm concerned that for too many of us, we are in exactly that state. We are living in a prison, often it's an emotional prison, that we have actually been set free from, that no longer has power over us, no longer needs or deserves to dominate our emotional landscape. The war is actually over. Freedom has been declared. The gates are open. The year of God's favour has come. Jesus has defeated sin, death, the devil, sickness, cynicism, disease. You don't have to stay in the prison camp all the time. You don't have to let the landscape of your life be defined by the razor wire of negativity. It is okay to be happy sometimes. Happiness does make best overall sense of the situation that God has placed you in. But you must first believe that the news is real and that it's good. And then you need to actually have the courage to walk out past the guards, out of the age of cynicism, and embrace the freedom that Christ has won. We need reminding sometimes about the significance of the time that we're living in. World history, as I said before, can be divided up into different ways, but in the end, there is no division more significant than BC and AD. AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, the age in which freedom is announced, freedom is here, brought to us by Jesus, freedom from sin, freedom from death, freedom from cynicism and endless misery and negativity. It's a message that is proclaimed to people who are in every emotional state, and it tells us of one who has entered the prison with us. And he has set us free from the inside. He has unlocked the gates from within. He now leads us to a promised land, a reality far greater than the mess that we see when we turn on the TV, a reality that we will one day see with unclouded vision. And even as we wait, we can still say, as Isaiah did in verse 10, I will greatly rejoice. I will rejoice in the Lord. My whole being will exult in my God, for he has clothed me with the garments of salvation. Thanks be to God. Amen.